Well, good morning to you, and I'll say good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and welcome to our next Menopause Morning chat. And this is a huge subject line today because as a woman, whether and honestly whether you're in childbearing years or perimenopause or menopause or postmenopausal, one of the things that obviously as a woman you want to avoid is breast cancer. And another like high risk factor that you tend to recognize more once you do enter into perimenopause, menopause, and become postmenopausal is also issues with osteoporosis and bone loss. And it's a very well documented that that is a somewhat likely issue for a lot of women. And part of it really goes back into a simple fact that when the recognition, and you've heard me say this before, about 2 million women in the US enter menopause every year. About 15% of them have no symptoms, well, short of you stop having a monthly cycle and you can't conceive. But all the other symptoms, which, we've talked about many of these already, tied into weight gain, mood swings, sleeplessness, fatigue, hot flashes, the osteoporosis we're talking about here tonight or this morning, and the whole array of different symptoms. Remember, that's what about 85% of you are going through, whereas 15% aren't dealing with anything. Now, the whole aspect of why I'm doing all these menopause mornings and why I talk about what I refer to as a new menopause is to really help you, if you're part of the 85%, be a part of the 15%, like grow that 15% to a much higher number. Because in essence, what we're looking for is for you to be able to maintain perfect hormone balance on your own. But with today though, specifically, we're going to talk about risk factors for breast cancer and also risk factors for osteoporosis. Now, with the recognition here is most women, perhaps yourself, you believe this to be a hormonal problem. And and even from the perspective of somebody who's had breast cancer, you might even been told it's an estrogen based breast cancer. And typically it's because either the what is recognized as the E1 or the E2 are basically too high. Whereas what you really want to have highest in regard to estrogens is actually something referred to as your E3, which is really the weakest estrogen. And when I say weak, not weak as far as what kind of a job can it do, but weak as far as is it carcinogenic for you, right? And typically speaking, this is not a hormone issue; it's a liver issue. And I'll go into that deeper in a moment. But it's also when we look at it from the perspective of osteoporosis, also. So the risk factors of losing bone is also usually thought of as a low estrogen issue. And once again, it's not necessarily the low estrogen as much as it is the liver issue. All right, now this is something that I test every single woman that I work with that are either trying to prevent menopause or going through, again, either perimenopause, menopause, or postmenopausal. And I'm always looking at a very comprehensive 24-hour urine collection to really look at 32 different hormones. But also very important, I'm not just looking at a multiple of hormones from a comprehensive perspective. I'm also looking at this from the perspective of what's causative factors of what's going on. Like there's an assessment in that test for your kidney function. There's an assessment in that test for your chronic disease risk factors, which can be tied into your gut health or inflammation. It's looking directly at your inflammatory responses. There's so much. And the important factor of what we're talking about today is that test also looks at your phase 1 and phase 2 liver factors. So the phase 1, and I'll just briefly mention the phase 2. The phase 2 is tied into methylation. Methylation is out of the 5 different ways at which your liver is going to detoxify, methylation has the most significant impact on detoxification from your liver. Now, outside of that, though, the phase 1 is what we're going to talk about here. So the phase 1 is basically how your body metabolizes and hydroxylates estrogens. All right, so So during this phase one process, there's a group of enzymes that are called cytochrome P450, and those enzymes are really the most important metabolic enzymes that are needed for your liver to function properly. And one of the key things that they're doing is they're basically hydroxylating your estrogens, which they're taking things like the estradiol and the estrone, which are more prone to drive a carcinogenic estrogen effect in your body. They're converting them into the estriol, which is the weaker and the preferred estrogen that you want to have at your highest. Like even when I'm looking at these results, what I'm always telling everyone that I work with is when we're looking at the estradiol and the estrone, so that's the E1 and E2 I mentioned earlier, and then the estriol, which is the E3, you want the sum of the estradiol, the E1, and the estrone, the E2, you want the sum of those to be equal to or less than the total of your E3, which is the estriol. And it's amazing how many times that I see this ratio out of balance, and it's out of balance because this phase one aspect of your liver just simply isn't working properly, right? And so when that's an issue, just in itself, just having your estrogens out of balance are beginning. These are now a risk factor for breast cancer for you. Now, on top of that, if your estradiol and your estrone, which is the E1 and E2, are too high, that's another risk factor for breast cancer. And collectively, and this is something that you see on every woman sees on the tests that I do with them, is there's a circle graph for what's going on with your phase one metabolism. And there's a red, yellow, and a green version of that circle graph. And the yellow, which is the recognition of carcinogenic estrogens in your body, you can have some, and a healthy immune system can actually keep this at bay. But the level that you want to have of the carcinogenic estrogens is at 7 or less. So when I'm seeing women who have 10, 11, 15, sometimes even higher levels of that, it's really the recognition that what you want to address is the liver. And of course, you still want to help the body in lowering those estrogens, but it's really the liver that's causing this problem. It's really the liver that's leaving you in this carcinogenic estrogen aspect because the phase one isn't working well. And what's happening is you're not converting that estriol and the estrone into the E3, which is the estriol. Yeah, so that's the really important factor. And then you have to think of, well, what's up with my liver, right? And I would say that from a high percentage, I would say at least 75% of the women that I work with, and I've literally looked at over 8,000 of these test kits in my career, and at least 75% are dealing with challenges in their liver. And this could be you as well. And so then you have to think about it from multiple different factors. Is number one, you have to look at, what am I doing to support my liver? Like, and I'll be really candid. I support my liver every single day, regardless of what that result would say for me. Yeah, because we simply live in a very toxic world. Yeah, and even I did talk about toxicity as being a trigger for menopause sometime last month, and it's something that if if you live in this world, you're taking in toxicity on a regular basis. So everybody's liver really does need support on a consistent basis. But it's not only about addressing supporting your liver. You have to look a little bit deeper to be like, well, what is impacting my liver and on what level? So when I see different body signs, which I did talk about in that video where I went over the trigger of toxicity and what's going on with your liver, I did go over and teach you those body signs. You can look back to that on my YouTube page under Menopause Morning. But the whole thing with that is that you have to figure out what's driving the liver. So a lot of times what I'll do is it's called a urine toxic clearance test. And you'd be amazed at the levels at which I'm seeing women are walking around in such a toxic level, whether it be heavy metal toxicity or chemical toxicity or environmental toxicity. But we're not realizing that in essence, what this is doing is it's driving this lack of proper function in the liver. And then the liver is not metabolizing that E1 and E2 into the E3, or really hydroxylation of it, and and then you're suffering on different levels. So that in itself is a huge part of risk factors for breast cancer. And I want to put in here as well the recognition that if you have any level of an estrogen dominance, that's another significant risk factor for breast cancer. And I see estrogen dominance, unfortunately, way too often, because most women, when they're trying to, and this could be you as well, when you're trying to address menopause symptoms, you may be using estrogen, either creams, patches, or pellets. And one of the big factors with that is that when you're using those forms, there's not a guarantee that it gets into the blood. And you can actually not even increase the estrogen in your blood, which is where you need the estrogen to be, because your hormones need your blood as a transport system. But what happens a lot of times is the estrogen builds up in your tissue, and then that ends up being another significant risk factor for breast cancer. So that, and on top of that, if you're doing anything to boost testosterone, whether you're taking something specifically to boost testosterone, or if you're getting if you're using a cream, or again pellets or patches with testosterone, you could be converting the testosterone into estrogen, thus causing this issue that we're talking about with elevated estrogens. So that's everything I wanted to bring up about the risk factors for breast cancer, but then also osteoporosis. So to have the degrading aspect of your bone health as you get older is really one of the debilitating things for a lot of women. And if you even look at the statistics of women tied into bone health, and then also risk factors for falling and breaking a hip, are pretty significantly high. And again, it's not just tied into low estrogen. This is another factor tied into the phase one metabolism of your liver. Yeah, because the other aspect that happens is when you're converting, you remember, based on that group of enzymes called the cytochrome P450s, which once again are the most important collection of enzymes for your liver function. It goes a long way in balancing what's going on between estrogen and bone health. And when I mentioned that, in that circle graph that I look at on my test kit with my clients on a regular basis, you want the carcinogenic estrogens to be at 7 or less, and you want the yellow, which is tied into the health of your bone, to be at 20%, but not. And it can be too high or too low, and whether it's too high or too low, those are then both risk factors for poor bone health, increasing your risk of breaking bones, increasing your risk of falling and breaking a hip, and really having this significant concern for you. And what's really awesome about this, so is I've had so many clients who've had their bone scans done for the bone density, and really have some significant issues here. But then when we work together in unison together, and really help not only with balancing hormones, but really more importantly, addressing what's leading to the liver issues, and then also supporting the liver. And I've seen significant levels of success with women having a complete different outlook on their bone scans as they move forward. Yeah, and again, you have to look at the liver aspect of this. Yeah, so in recapping today, the things that I really want you to recognize is, number one, is your liver, specifically the phase one metabolism of your liver, which is tied into primarily focused on the group of enzymes in the cytochrome P450, which are the most important enzyme group for your liver function. They play a major role in the conversion of your estrogens. You always want your E3, which is the weakest estrogen, which is what occurs when all this is working properly. You want that to be the most dominant of your estrogen. So remember, the estradiol and the estrone, you want the two of those collectively to be equal to or less than your E3, which is the estriol. So that's a key factor. And also recognizing that the other risk factors of breast cancer are, either that ratio being off, or you're just phase one metabolism not working well, and now your carcinogenic estrogens are over 7, or you're just dealing with some level of an estrogen dominance. And the great thing is all of those are workable. Once you find these things out, you can do things to really balance the liver. You can do things to support the liver. You can do things to eliminate the challenges that are really triggering your liver. You can also do things to really help naturally to lower the estrogen levels if need be, and to really get this all in balance. And in regard to your bone health, the recognition that while yes, it could be tied into some low estrogen, but more primarily tied into, again, this phase one metabolism in your liver. Yeah, and if you're significantly below 20 or over 20, those are really, significant risk factors for your bone health. Yes, I want to bring this up today so you can really learn the primary risk factors, again, for breast cancer or for osteoporosis. Know that there's ways to test this, and there's ways to address this to get back into the proper balance that you specifically are looking for. Yeah. So, and this is all part of, again, what I call new menopause. And menopause is, what's interesting about it. New menopause isn't new. New menopause is really what menopause used to be. When women would go from childbearing years through perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopausal as barely a speed bump in their drive of life, and with the recognition that your body, whether you believe in God or some other higher power, your body has already been created and designed to really maintain perfect hormone balance through that entire transition. And when you're not there, it's basically just a sign of deeper things that need to be worked on. And one of them, as we're talking about today. So I look forward to seeing you again on future Menopause Mornings. This typically occurs every Tuesday morning live at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So 9 a.m. Pacific time, noon Eastern time zone. And any questions or comments you may have, whether you're watching this on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or TikTok or anywhere, I'm going to start spreading this out into everything on social media. Please leave your comments and questions for me below, and I will address these for you personally. And also below the video, I will post a link where you can get my free book in an electronic form of Fat, Fatigued, and Frustrated, which is a book of the simple foundational things that you need to work on to go start your path of really creating hormone balance. So you can get that free book, and then you'll also be on the email list for the Menopause Mornings, because what I do is every Monday night or Tuesday morning, I send out a reminder that I'm going to be doing this with the subject line for you, so you can be connected to really what's going on with you from a menopause perspective. So have a great day, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.